At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
I figured out that all the depression that I had for those years was really grief. It wasn't depression, it was really grief of loss, of not knowing, But like I said, towards the end, I had to, I pretty much basically detached myself from I detached myself from that grief. I detached myself from that craving of, wanting to know. Because in Buddhism, what creates our suffering is our craving, is our attachment to things that we cannot change. So that's what helped.
Imagine spitting into a tube, sending off your DNA, and unknowingly turning your life upside down. For me, and thousands of others, this is our reality. I'm your host, Alexis Auerselt. In July of 2021, I discovered that I am an NPE, someone who has experienced a non-paternal event. In other words, my biological father isn't who I thought he was. This podcast shares the journeys of people who were shocked by a DNA discovery, mostly through modern DNA testing. We're telling the stories of NPEs, adoptees, and donor-conceived people and their families. This is DNA Surprises. Some DNA surprise stories are harder to unravel than others. When Linda found out about her NPE, she was nearly 60 years old, and both her mother and birth certificate father had passed. In this week's episode, Linda shares how she was able to track down the identity of her biological father despite genealogical challenges such as endogamy. I also want to add a quick content warning for this episode. Because Linda can't ask any of her parents about her conception, she does not know if she was the result of a consensual relationship or sexual assault, and she mentions this. If you have experienced sexual abuse, please contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673 for support. Thank you, Linda, for sharing your story.
Okay, my name is Linda, and I am 67, and I was born in Chicago. In 2014, I had done the ancestry test, and I was curious because I grew up believing that I was half Polish and half German. Okay. Mm-hmm. But when I was growing up, I always kind of intuited that wasn't really right. And so the more I started reading about these NPE stories, after I found out that I was, I read that there's always some type of intuition, or a friend of mine called it like a blood memory, but you can't prove anything, right? Until you get like a DNA test. And so the sole reason that I took a DNA test, as I said, I believed I was half German and half Polish. My mother was Polish. My father, or the man who raised me, who I believe was my father, was German. He came from Germany in the 1920s. The sole reason I took a DNA test was because, and this might sound weird, I've done 13 trips to India. I'm a yoga teacher, and I've studied in India. And I had never I had never gone overseas in my life. I went solo. I'd never gone overseas in my life until I was 51. And as soon as I stepped on Indian ground, I felt like I had come home. I mean, the feeling was just so primal. It's really hard to explain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd done all these trips to India and everything. And I remember my mother had told, I was dark. I have, almost black hair. My eyes are brown. They're almost, black, very dark brown. And even though my parents were light haired, and light eyes, being Polish and German.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother had always told me growing up, because I was so dark, she said that I have gypsy blood in me. Okay, of course, like gypsy is like a racist term now,
Right.
but she said I had gypsy blood in me. That's why I was so dark. But I'm lighter skinned, and so I knew that the Roma people actually came through Eastern Europe, or migrated into Europe from the North India, Pakistan area. So my thought was, wow, I'm like, I feel so connected to India, and really feels like my second home. Maybe I have some DNA from India. So I took the DNA test. It was the first one. I took 3. First one was Ancestry. And this was 2014, and I was 59, right? So I get the DNA test back, get the results. I'm like, ooh, I'm like so excited to find some Indian from India DNA. Well, it was an Indian from India. It was like Native at the time. Ancestry had it as Native American. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I looked, and I'm thinking, okay, why is like 99% of the DNA matches in Ancestry, why do they have Spanish last names?
Wow.
Right? So I'm like, wait a minute, wait. I'm like, DNA doesn't lie, but because they solve like 20-year-old crimes with just a little,
Right.
piece of DNA, right? But I'm thinking, wait a minute, okay, I got to take another DNA test, because just to make sure. So I did 23andMe for my second DNA test. Came back, same results. Most of the DNA matches had Hispanic, or Spanish, last names. I went and I did a third DNA test.
Oh my gosh.
I did my heritage. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, because it's like, what?
Yeah, just that disbelief.
Yeah, exactly. Just to make sure, okay, I'll do 3 DNA tests. My heritage came back, same thing. Most of the DNA matches, so in all these DNA tests, the majority of DNA matches, I mean, high majority, like over 90%, were Spanish last names.
What was your initial thought? How were you feeling when you saw that?
My initial thought was that it just confirmed what I had always intuited. Okay. Because when I was a kid, I'd look in the mirror and I'd think, I really thought I was adopted, and I'm not. I really thought I was adopted because I didn't look like my parents, And then when I found out these results, it was like always, I had more than one thought. Like I said, my first thought was okay, this confirmed what I always intuited. And I was actually ecstatic. I was so happy. And then very soon thereafter, I just really plunged into the deepest depression. Okay. And I was really in this really deep, of course I could still function in my life. I'm a yoga teacher. I still teach classes, all this other stuff. But I was in a really deep depression for a really long while. So
were you able to contact your parents to ask them questions?
no, my parents are dead.
Okay.
I actually moved out when I was 18 because my mother was abusive. So I moved out when I was 18 and basically never looked back. Nobody ever told me the truth. I have no idea whether the man I thought was my father ever knew the truth. And I was born when my mother was 41. So in the 50s, I think that was kind of a late age for women to have children. Because, women were, having kids when they were 18, 19, in their 20s and everything. And my mother never told me the truth about everything. But then thinking back, when I started thinking about all this, there were like little signs, maybe like, okay, my name is Linda, which is a Spanish name, it means pretty in Spanish.
Right.
And she would always emphasize that I had like a Spanish first name. She always encouraged me to, when I was growing up in Chicago, I went to Chicago Public School. The grammar school had Spanish lessons for kids in the 7th and 8th grade. I started taking Spanish when I was in grammar school. And this was in the 60s. And I just remember just little different things that might have pointed to that, but my mother never said anything to me about it. And the one thing I remember, though, that all of a sudden like popped into my mind with all these, after the DNA test and everything, was that my mother never, like I said, she was abusive. She had some mental problems. And my mother never even told me about her side of the family. I mean, my father, the man who raised me, told me a lot about Germany. I came from Germany, this and that. My mother never said a word about her family, where they came from. I didn't even know where my father's side came from until I started doing the DNA test. And the one thing I remember, I was probably about like 4 or 5 years old. She took me to meet her mother. So my grandmother, my Polish grandmother. And the only thing I remember was that my grandmother told me that I look Mexican. And that was it. I was like, we left the room and never saw her again.
Wow.
I had no contact whatsoever with my, at that time, it was only her mother was alive. And like I said, no, this was never mentioned to me. So the only thing I could figure out was that my mother was either assaulted or, she had an affair. I mean, she was always with my father. They had a store on the south side of Chicago. And, thinking back on all this, I thought, well, is this why my mother had mental illness? And, is that why she was abusive? Not so much like physically, but more emotional abuse. Like I said, I moved out when I was 18 and never looked back. And so now going back to all the DNA tests, I thought, okay, well, how am I going to find out the truth? I mean, no one is alive who can tell me anything, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, I felt this depression because my heritage was stolen from me,
Right.
My roots were stolen from me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, how am I going to, research this? So I'm sure you probably know what search angels are.
Mm-hmm.
And because I couldn't afford any big ancestry search. And so I can't remember how soon after my discovery that I got this first search angel. And she was pretty good. I mean, she put together, a good DNA tree on ancestry and everything. The thing was, she was not an expert in endogamy. And endogamy is when cousins marry cousins, right?
Mm.
So it was really hard to figure out like where exactly what family I descended from. Because all my matches on Ancestry and, all the other, Ancestry tests, they're all cousins. I would have some first cousins, a lot of second cousins, a lot of third cousins, cousins farther back than third cousins. And the thing with endogamy is that my DNA, my Mexican DNA, was coming from the same family. Basically. I mean, there are a number of other families involved. I descend from 3 families from Zacatecas, Mexico. They were all in the same, come to find out later, that they all were from the same area in this small rancho in Zacatecas, Mexico. So, because when they came to Mexico from Spain, I'm assuming that these same families all traveled together and they all, bought this land in Mexico. So a lot of cousins were marrying cousins. And so it was really hard to find out who exactly my biological father was. And I have to say that I finally discovered after 7 years who my biological father was last November. And I'll get to that story.
Oh my gosh. So it took 7 years before you got the answer because of the endogamy component.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's like when I read these stories, there's all these, NPE groups on Facebook and everything. When I read these stories, I mean, people are like, oh yeah, I found out who my biological father was, just not, everybody was having these stories, telling stories, they found out right away. Well, if you descend from very endogamous families, you might never find out because all the DNA is the same. It's not like you descend from two separate families, right? Like your grandparents, or like say like your grandmother is like a Smith and your grandfather is a Jones. Here you have two totally separate genetic lines, right? Mm-hmm. But in my case, it was like, the common Spanish name is Perez. If like two Perez cousins married each other, so that DNA is coming from the same family. So you can't really, it's hard to like separate it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So it wasn't like two really distinct. I did not have of course, there's like the polar side. There was like my mother's DNA, but then all the Mexican DNA was basically coming from the same genetic pool, so to speak. So the first search angel, quit. And she just basically said, I'm sorry, I just can't, I don't know enough about, she even had somebody else look at my matches on Ancestry. She goes, I don't know enough about endogamy to figure this out. She said, you will have to find out for certain who your biological father was. She says, you will have to have like somebody like an aunt, an uncle, grandparent, somebody like very close, like test. Where we can really figure this out, like a niece, a nephew, half brother, half sister, somebody in that close relationship, but in order to figure out who a biological father is.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Like I said, I mean, everybody was showing up, cousin. I even had one cousin on Ancestry. She is a first cousin once removed on one side, but she's basically, it's either like a second or third cousin on the other side. So she's like a double cousin.
Wow. Okay. So it's so complicated.
It's very complicated. So people who have trouble finding out their biological parent, I would strongly suggest that they explore endogamy, like read up on that, find, because not all people who do genetic research like this can figure out endogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. It's very complicated. And believe me, I've learned more than I want to know about endogamy.
Is endogamy very common, like in Mexico, or?
It's common. Yeah, it's common in Mexico. It's actually, I found out it's common in Jewish families. It's common in Native American families. It led me actually to my second search angel because I was in this, NPE group, and people were talking about, I wish I could find a, search angel, blah blah blah. And I said, well, I'm like, yeah, like I wish I could find a search angel with like, knows about endogamy. And this woman, messaged me. She goes, I know, a little bit more than endogamy than the average DNA researcher because she was from Australia and she does a lot in Maori, mm-hmm. The indigenous in New Zealand. And she says they are very heavily endogamous. And so she said, if you give me permission, go on your Ancestry, 23andMe, and my heritage and all that. And she is the one who discovered, again, after 7 years, the name of my biological father. And the only reason that happened is because, all these years, 7 years, I'm getting the notices from, or, the emails from the DNA testing companies, you have a match, this match, this cousin, third cousin, fifth cousin. Well, I wasn't interested in that. I have like literally 600 people in my DNA tree and Ancestry. Most of them are cousins,
And were you just during that time, what were you feeling? Were you spending a lot of time thinking about it and trying to research, or, what was your life like while you didn't know?
Well, I mean, my life went on, normally. I mean, I was still dealing with depression, and I basically resigned myself at my age because, I found out when I was 59. I mean, this last year I was 67. I actually just totally resigned myself to, I wasn't attached to finding out about my, biological father anymore. I just thought, hey, at my age, there's probably nobody alive who can tell me anything. And I basically resigned myself to never, ever learning out the name of my biological father. I just resigned myself to it, which actually helped me a lot with my depression about it.
Yeah.
And I should say, in the meantime, I connected with some close cousins, like first and second cousins on Ancestry, because we would message, because like you get a match, I would message like the close matches on 23andMe or Ancestry. So I actually connected with some cousins who actually live about an hour from me. Some Mexican cousins.
Wow.
I actually met them 2 years ago before COVID in 2019. And it was like, they were just so happy. Like nobody knew who my biological father was. People had some ideas, like, because it had to be somebody who was up in Chicago, at this time. They're like, oh my God, you look like, I'm not going to mention, the last names. You look like, this, blah, blah, blah. And because I actually had another conflict with this, I'm half Mexican. My biological father was Mexican. Can I even call myself Mexican?
Right.
The thing is that nobody ever, when I was growing up, nobody ever thought that I was like Polish and German. Like nobody. It was either like, oh, you look Middle Eastern, you look Italian.
Right. So how did you kind of grapple with that ethnic identity?
To be honest, I was like, okay, that explains it.
Yeah.
That explains it. Ironically, my first husband is Mexican.
Oh.
And we actually lived in South Texas with his mother and stepfather. This was, years ago. So I always kind of was in or familiar with the Mexican culture. It wasn't foreign to me, whatsoever at all. I mean, I speak Spanish, I can understand Spanish, I can read Spanish. It just felt right,
Yeah.
And so when I met my cousins, can I even say that I'm Mexican, even though I'm not raised in the Mexican culture? So, because I didn't want to, I'm very aware of, cultural appropriation, and I was in a room with my cousins, people who, I had never met, who didn't know me, immediately started treating me like I was their, I was a long lost cousin, I was part of the family. And I asked them, I said, I have a very serious question. And, they're like, what, ask us. And I said, can I call myself Mexican? Because my, biological father, who I don't know who he is, was Mexican. And they all looked at me shocked. And they all started yelling at me at the same time. They're like, of course you're Mexican.
Oh.
Yes, your father's Mexican. Yes, you're Mexican. And it was just so, I just felt so wanted.
Yeah. Sounds like that was very affirming.
But I never really felt from my own mother.
Yeah.
So that was it. I was like, boom, depression, gone. 5 years. 5 years in depression, gone.
That's amazing.
So last November, like I said, I keep getting these messages from Ancestry, 23andMe, from my heritage, who have DNA matches. I look, okay, third cousin, fourth cousin, fifth. Okay, fine. I don't need any more cousins. I want to know somebody closer. I get the one message from my heritage, and it said niece or half niece. And I felt it was like I fell off my chair. What? This is the first time in 7 years that somebody tested who is not a cousin. So immediately I go to my heritage, I look. The last name is one of the families from that small area of Zacatecas, Mexico. So I take all that information and I start messaging my cousins who I'm chatting with already. And they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay. And I look at the picture. So then I send this information to my search angel that I had. She immediately goes on Ancestry. She's going, my heritage. She's like, oh my God. She says, this is so huge because she's actually, my heritage said she'd be a grandniece, but that's impossible because I can only be a grandniece if I had a full brother or sister. I don't have any full brother and sister.
Right.
This meant that her, one of her parents was a half sibling. She was a half niece. The search angel, starts digging in Facebook, different places. She sent me her Facebook profile. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. This young woman is, I'd say 30s, like early 30s. She looks like she could be a sister or my daughter.
Wow.
Same smile, same eyes, same shape of the face. And so my search angel found out that her father is my half brother, and there was another half brother and another half sister who are no longer alive. So I just have her father is my half brother, and to actually send a message to this young woman on my heritage. Never know if she ever read it. I sent a message to her on Facebook. She didn't respond. I don't even know if she saw it. Some people don't even see their messages on Facebook, mm-hmm. right? And don't even read messages on the, DNA sites. And so I said, I said to myself, and I told my search angel, I said, you know what? I said, I have nothing to lose. She found out who the name of my search angel found out like within like half an hour who the name of my biological father was.
Wow.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
TaxAct knows small business owners can sometimes use a little help with their taxes. That's why TaxAct has Expert Assist, a team of live tax experts ready to answer any questions you may have. Think of them as your own personal sidekick. Not like one of those funny talking animal sidekicks, more like the super smart nerding out on tax code and business casual attire sidekick, but just as helpful and lovable. TaxAct. Let's get them over with.
So I told the search angel, this is a messenger, didn't hear anything or this and that. Like I said, she found out the name of, her father, my half brother. I just told her everyone's information is on the internet, right? You can plug in anybody's name, find out where they live, what their telephone number is, everything. So that's what I did. I bought reports on them. And I said, I don't have anything to lose. I know the name of my biological father was, and I'm going to write them a letter. Forget message, Facebook, forget message to DNA site. Send everybody a letter.
Did they live in the same city as you, or were they living?
No, they're in California. And I said, you know what? If they respond, they respond. If not, not. I can't stay attached to this anymore. And I found out the name of my biological father. That's the only thing I wanted to know. And my half-brother called me probably within the same week that he probably received my letter.
And what was that conversation like?
It really went well. So,
did he know about you?
Interestingly enough, he said that he told me that there was another woman who contacted him some years ago. I don't know exactly when, who also said that she was his half-sister, but never followed up. She didn't stay in touch or anything like that. She just, wanted to tell him that, hey, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't follow up, she didn't follow up. But as soon as we talked, he was so glad to hear from me. And he actually sent me pictures, texted me a lot of pictures of his father. It's hard for me to say our father, it's even hard for me to say half brother because it's so foreign to me. So we've talked a couple times on the phone, and I've actually messaged more than a few times with his daughter, my half niece, who looks so much like me. And that's the first thing I said in the letter. I said, you know what? I know this is going to be very shocking to you, but I believe, and I gave the name, was my biological father, and you're my half brother, and this woman is my half niece. And I actually printed out a photograph of me and my half niece, and kind of like did a Photoshop thing, and kind of like split them, put them like side by side, and I was like, oh my God, this is just.
So this was in November?
It's just last November.
Okay,
yeah.
so I mean, what do you hope for your relationship with him? Do you hope to meet him or any of your?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Whenever all this COVID gets over, because I really don't want to fly anywhere.
Mhm. Well, that's so exciting.
Yeah, and it's.
Have you learned anything about him and maybe does that like explains anything about your personality or interests or anything like that?
Not so much. Not so much about my personality or interest. All I know is that he was in the Korean War, and because I have a picture of him in uniform, and my half brother told me that he did live in Chicago, and worked in the steel mills in Chicago, which was on the south side of Chicago. They were in the southeast side of Chicago, and my parents lived on the southwest side of Chicago. But I have no idea how they would have met or anything like that. I don't know if it was unfair. I don't know if it was an assault, because his age in Chicago was certainly not in his 40s or 30s. He was in his 20s when he was in Chicago. And my mother had me when she was 41. I have no idea what happened. And I really don't care.
How did your like friends and, if you have a partner or anything, how did they react to this?
Let's see, in 7 years, people's reactions just run the gamut. People are either like, wow, like, it's like they feel sorry for you, feel sad for you, like growing up that way. Oh my God, how can you not know? I mean, people really, what I discovered, I mean, there are a hell of a lot more NPEs than like people will ever realize.
Oh, yes.
Ever realize. I mean, people have like no idea. And actually people who grow up and I'll put it in quotes, I'm doing like air quotes now with my fingers, right? People that grow up in like happy families, or grow up with like, they know their aunts, they know their uncles, grow up with their grandparents, they run around with their cousins. They have no freaking clue what it's like to, I mean, seriously, to grow up without a big family, without running around with cousins and aunts and uncles, and people have no idea, and they think you're some type of freak for growing up like that. I mean, seriously.
Yeah. Is there anything that you've done to kind of feel more connected to your Mexican side, just culturally?
It's like like I said, like I've always felt that way. I mean, I've always done things like that. I mean, it's really kind of hard to describe. As a friend of mine called it, it's like blood memory. I already know about it, even though I didn't grow up in the Mexican culture.
What are some things that you've done that have just kind of helped you process throughout this journey?
Like I said, I'm a yoga teacher, and I don't teach the type of yoga that is the way people in the West think yoga is all about. Let's twist ourselves into a pretzel and put a leg behind my neck. I teach authentic yoga that is all about the relief from suffering. That's authentic yoga. That's real yoga. And so that's the ultimate goal of yoga. So I'm very familiar with meditation, and I'm a Buddhist. That's my self-care, is meditation and yoga. And the whole philosophy of not being attached to things, and that we create our own suffering. So I had to delve deeply into my training as a Buddhist and as a yoga teacher as far as relief from my own suffering about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm actually good with, if we never meet, I'm actually pretty fine with that. No, I really am. And he's a phone call away. And, we had talked about, hey, when this, COVID stuff gets better, going out to meet. And I'm still going to meet, I still want to fly down to my, meet my cousins in Houston, still planning that. It's like, I feel like I know these people already.
Right.
We call each other cousin all the time in Spanish. Hey, prima, ¿cómo está?
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. What advice would you give to a parent who might be hiding a DNA surprise from their child?
Oh my God, my advice to a parent who is hiding this is, you know what? Tell the damn truth. Tell the truth. Even if it hurts you, tell the truth to your child. That could save so much grief. That could save so much pain. Truth is always better in the light, so to speak.
Yeah. And what advice would you offer someone who just found out that they are an NPE?
Number one, you're not alone. You are not alone, because that's your first thing. Oh my God, who's going to believe this? What? How can this happen? You have no idea how much, how many people have the same story. Not same story, but similar story, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there's actually a saying in India, same but different. When NPEs are same but different. We're all the same.
So true.
Yes. But it's a different story, right? Everybody has a different story, but same but different. Makes sense, right?
Oh, that's perfect. Yes.
Know that you're not alone. And actually, my advice would be, if I was doing a meditation training or a yoga training to, a group of NPEs, I would actually talk about, what we talked about the craving, the attachment, that is going to cause your suffering, So you have to learn to, and I know it's easy, but not simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to learn how to detach from that to save yourself pain.
That's such good advice.
It's, like I said, simple, but not easy.
Yeah. Well, Linda, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your story. Best of luck on your journey. I hope you get a chance to meet your brother and niece, and thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks again to Linda for sharing her story. If you have a DNA surprise story that you'd like to share, please email dnasurprises@gmail.com. And if you haven't yet, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Until next time.